how do you think about AI as it relates to a threat to your business? I would warrant to say that a PDF sent through an email is not easily crawlable by a large language model. And since you are publishing super niche and probably a lot of the news you're publishing is kind of exclusive to you, you have a huge moat, maybe unintentionally, not realizing that this wave was coming, but you have a huge moat against LLMs like sucking up all your information and then degrading your value over time.
You're absolutely right, because we're not discoverable on the web, which has become a virtue and not a vice as time has gone on. There isn't that risk of an AI model just picking us up unless they actively subscribe to us. What's more of a risk is a big subscriber that has so many bits of information coming into the company that they decide to centralize it and chuck it all in an AI model to generate a daily summary. And that's probably more of a threat to us. At the moment, that's not really happening.
Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. There's a certain irony that one of the most influential publications covering Australia's telecommunications industry still arrives each morning as a daily PDF. But that format has become central to the success of Communications Day, the niche B2B outlet founded by Grahame Lynch in 1994. What began as a fax-delivered newsletter covering the early deregulation of Australia's telecom market evolved into an indispensable industry briefing read by executives, regulators, infrastructure providers, and tech companies across Australia and New Zealand. While much of digital media spent the last 2 decades chasing page views, social traffic, and algorithmic disruption, Lynch built a highly profitable subscription business by doing almost the opposite, keeping his journalism off the open web, tightly controlling distribution, and turning Communications Day into a daily habit for nearly everyone working in the sector. In a recent interview, Lynch explained why Communications Day still distributes its journalism as a PDF despite the rise of blogs and social media, how he built a subscription business with near total market penetration in a niche B2B sector, and why conferences now account for nearly half the company's revenue. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, gently tap on the subscribe button so you can watch more interviews with the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey, Grahame, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
So super excited to talk to you because, every now and then I have like a whole range of media entrepreneurs on the show, kind of like what you would consider more traditional creators by today's standards. And then sometimes I get these people on who, started something years ago and it's fun to talk about them because they can tell this kind of story of the history of the internet and how their media company, adapted over time. And you're definitely one of those. In fact, from what I can tell from looking at your publication, like it's still sit as a PDF. And whenever I talk to like some of these folks who've been sending newsletters in the 90s, a lot of them started out like sending PDFs and then eventually like their strategy morphed and then they started sending or doing more traditional blogging or newsletters and stuff like that. So I'm going to be super fascinated to talk about that with you. So I think you started your comms, it's called Comms Daily. You're based in Australia, right?
Yeah, that's right, in Australia. It's actually Communications Day is the specific title of the publication, which everyone shortened to Comms Day because it's easier to say.
Yeah,
And
Communications Daily.
yeah. Your introduction actually summed up a big part of what we're about quite adroitly, in that we are still a PDF, and there are some very, very good reasons for that.
Yeah, we'll definitely jump into those. So it's Communications Daily. You're based in Australia, but you also cover New Zealand, and it's a B2B publication that covers the telecom industry, right?
That's right, telecom and internet, and increasingly things like data centers and all the physical infrastructure around AI. And because it's a fast growing area, we're constantly adapting to new types of business models and new types of customers. So it's not just the traditional old telecom companies, it's a whole tapestry of different types of readers.
Yeah, and you also charge a lot of money for this. So we'll get into all of this, but I really want to start with kind of the origin story. So were you working in B2B media? Was this an industry you were covering? So I think it was founded in 1994, is that correct?
That's right. I was quite young. I was 25 years old when I started it. I started off writing for a stock market publication. for a publisher called Ian Huntley, who published a whole bunch of business newsletters. And I was the youngest guy on staff. I was 21 actually when I joined there. So as you might expect in a company full of 50-year-old writers, I was throwing all the technology stories to write about because all this newfangled tech was too difficult for the greybeards in the company. So I, at a very young age, became quite conversant with all the various aspects of technology. And of course, this was before the internet.
Yeah, yeah. So
So
when you say newsletter, it was either, I'm guessing, either physically sent,
yeah, it
or
was a
it was
print.
or is
Yeah,
faxed or something like that.
yeah, it was printed every Friday and sent out to subscribers. So I parlayed that into writing for a B2B technology newsletter. And then in 1994, decided that there was, that these publications were all weekly or monthly. I saw an opportunity, funnily enough. You just mentioned fax, and that was what drove me to do it, to do a fax daily. Now, at the time, there were a few B2B publishers in the UK and the US doing fax dailies. They were just little one-page cheat sheets, one line, two-line stories. I trusting my potential readers to actually maintain long fax rolls overnight, put out 3 or 4 page newsletters every day for the telecom sector. And I launched this in the middle of 1994. And this was at a time, and this was happening worldwide, where most countries had a monopoly telco. You had British Telecom in the UK, you had the baby bells in the US. There wasn't a big universe. But there was a period of liberalization occurring where competition was being introduced, mobile phones were just coming in, and governments were licensing 3 or 4 different mobile phone operators to provide some competition. So there was suddenly this potential galaxy of subscribers in a space that had previously been pretty cozy, pretty monopolized. The best source of news was probably your internal company memorandum. Um, so that was the environment in which we started. And
And what did you
by
have? Did you have interest in this industry because you were working for a publication that covered the stock market? Like, was it just like, I see this as an emergent industry, and I see this as like a market move that I'm gonna like cover this industry on its upswing, or was there some kind of interest that led into it?
Oh, it was a bit of both. It was that I enjoyed writing about technology, and I knew the people in Australia, particularly then, was a small place. In the sense that you could get to know all the major players in tech in Australia pretty quickly. And so at the ripe old age of 24, I had a pretty decent black book. There aren't many other jobs apart from journalism where you can do that at that age. So I was quite blessed in that respect. But what happened when I started Comms Day was the most interesting thing because it coincided with the beginning of the internet. And by happenstance, I happened to rent some office space off one of Australia's one of the first of the 4 foundation ISPs in the country, who at that point housed nearly 30% of the nation's websites. Of course, it was a very, very small universe back in those days. So I got to basically rock up into work every day as a journalist, seeing how the innards of an ISP worked. We shared a copy machine, we shared the bathroom, so I knew exactly what was going on there. So it was almost like this fantastic informal degree in this emerging thing that we call the internet. So that was what really sent me on my way because I got it straight away as to what this was all about and worked on developing readers in that sector. And that was what took us from being something very niche to something that was, in a sense, chronicling the rise of a brand new industry and kind of economic mode of production.
Yeah. So you're 24 years old. Did you like quit your job? Like, what was kind of the catalyst that this where you decided to do it right then?
Oh, I was encouraged by a friend to quit my job and do it on my own, and it was a daily, so it had to be full time. It would have killed me otherwise if I'd been running a full time job at the same time. In the early days, I did capitalize on the fact that I was one of the very few journalists in Australia who understood telco and the internet. And I did a lot of freelance writing for mainstream publications like the Sydney Morning Herald, a weekly news magazine at the time called The Bulletin, that was sort of like Australia's Newsweek, the Financial Review, which is our version of the Wall Street Journal. So I supplemented my income initially with a lot of freelance income, but of course that was a virtuous circle. It meant that people had to talk to me for my articles because I was talking to wider readerships and not just to my narrow subscriber base. So that helped build it up in the first few years.
So you moved into this office. So how did you? So talk me through the launch. Like, how did you find your initial readers? Like, how did you deliver it to them? Like, how did you market yourself?
Well, I've been working in the sector for a couple of years, and I consciously developed a very, very big business card collection. So everyone put their fax numbers on their business cards in those days. And unlike now, where you have to be very careful to not break spam laws, there was a bit of a novelty in, oh, this guy I met, Grahame Lynch, has just sent me his new fax newsletter and on a trial basis. And people loved it because of the novelty aspect of it. And the fact that I was also ringing them up at the same time, asking them for stories, getting quotes off them. So that again, you had to subscribe to it because you wanted to see what was being written about you. So that there was a big element of that as well. And of course, that drives all B2B, but it was particularly so in this case. And there was a certain intimacy that came with receiving something off the fax at 6 in the morning that people really got into.
Yeah. So I'm sitting in my office. I work in the telecom industry, and one day in 1994, my fax machine fires up and spits out a piece of paper. I go to look at it, and it's this comms daily, communications daily, and
Yeah.
it says this is a free trial. Here's the news, and somewhere on it says if you want to continue receiving this, call this number. Or what was kind of the modus, or what was the order of operations and how they received it and how they converted it to subscribers.
Oh, we telemarketed, but you could do things like that in those days. Yeah, we followed up with a phone call. I had someone helping me out. Um, at various, I had different people. At one stage, I had someone who was a radio DJ who was in between jobs, so I had the most professional sounding telemarketer in the country. um, and we just smooth talked people into it, basically. But they saw value in the product, and yeah, we pretty quickly got to, I'd say we got to about 300 subscribers pretty quickly. I can't remember the exact time frame. I'd say within 18 months, we were at 300 subscribers.
Yeah. And for context, like back then there was no easy way to do like recurring payments. So you literally just had to send them an invoice like every year or whatever, right?
Which in a funny way we still do, because many of our legacy customers like treat us a certain way in their accounting system, and they like to have the big group subscription for the whole company paid once a year. It's neater from a budgeting point of view. Not much has changed from that point. The way people want to pay for us. We don't do monthly subscriptions at all. It's a nasty area that's about to be hit by regulation. So we want to stay out of that kind of thing.
Yeah. So you get 300 subscribers. How much were you charging all the way back then?
um, we were charging about just under $1,000 for a single subscription. We didn't really do group subscriptions then because your subscription was effectively to the room that had the fax machine in it, if that makes sense. Whoever was the recipient who passed it on to their colleagues, it might have been, for example, an office floor. So you could have multiple subscriptions across the same company because they were in discrete office locations. That's all changed now with email. There's no physical dimension to the receipt of it. Everyone gets it at the same time, and we now tend to have corporate subscriptions covering an entire company.
So you have these subscriptions, and then like I was looking at an example that you sent me of the PDF. Like it looks like you do have advertising in it now, or at least some brand logos and stuff like that. Was that in the model early on, or was it like purely a subscription business to start with?
No, actually, what you're seeing is a conference that we've created. It's our conference. So we only advertise our own products, in other words, in the PDF. And you've seen a lot of logos because we have over 30 sponsors for that conference and their logos. So, these are big global telecom companies like Ericsson and Nokia and Cisco, along with companies local to Australia who want to sponsor the Australian Industry Conference for telco.
Okay, yeah, and I do want to get into talking about the events side, but just kind of to keep on going through kind of the evolution of the publication. So, how did it eventually start to? Or so was it just you by yourself? You were just writing this thing every day, calling people up, pulling in quotes, and then just like sending it in the morning or the evening or whatever to start with.
Yeah, basically, I'll give you a construct of and it hasn't actually changed much actually over 30 years the way we do it. We write it during the day. It's the day's news. We finish it in the evening. It gets put in a queue to be broadcast out in the early hours of the morning. And then everyone's got it in their, back in those days, they're in tray, and now they're in box at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. We do it that early to take allowance of the fact we have a New Zealand and Pacific Islands readership who are a couple of time zones ahead of Australia. So we want to make sure they get it in time for their kind of breakfast before going to work thing. Back in those days, it was basically me doing all the writing with an offsider who did all the admin and the sales and the business side. We added people mainly to the sales admin function in the first few years. And then I started to hire journalists to help me. And even now, we only really have 4 full-time journalists writing it, which I guess isn't too bad for a B2B newsletter in a country with only 26 million people. But we basically find that between 4 people, if you have any more, it actually becomes quite hard to cover a beat properly because you want news works in themes and you want the same journalist to be on the same story as it evolves over months and years.
Yeah, and so was there any like word of mouth type of things where like you'd get these cold phone calls that so and so heard about your publication, the fax or whatever, or was this purely a sale, like a telemarketing sales type thing? Like that's where 100%
Oh, a
of
bit
your
of both.
yeah.
Yeah, a bit of both. A bit of both. There are obviously people who hung back on subscribing. I want to see if this lasts. I'm not going to give this guy $1,000 and hope that he's still there in 10 months' time. So there were people who hung back. And I think, and this, if there's anything, any advice that can be taken from a viewer of this, is that people do hang back and often wait to see if you make it into a second or a third year before committing resource to you, particularly if it's not their own money. There's a different dynamic in B2B, and you don't want to waste your company's money on something that goes broke in a few months. So there was an element of that. And it was actually the second and the third year where I knew we were a goer. I knew this was going to be a successful business. And because we had really, really comprehensive buy-in. From the point of view, you have a universe of people who you want to subscribe. And that's how you measure, it's a KPI, what percentage of my desired universe is subscribing. And we got to a very high percentage within about 3 years.
So how did it evolve from there, from something that was sent over fax machines to something that was being distributed over the internet?
The key date was around the year 2000, funnily enough. We'd started doing some email before that, where basically a percentage of people wanted it by email. The year 2000, 2001 was the key year when it flipped and became entirely email. So that's quite early on in its history. That's reasonably coincides with the mass adoption of corporate email and companies getting enough bandwidth into their operations that they could handle 20 or 30 PDFs arriving within a 10-minute half-hour period in the early hours of the morning without collapsing their network. And also the availability of broadcast systems that allowed that type of thing. And once the transition occurred, it happened really quickly, which is another lesson about technology inflection. Once something moves, it often moves super quick. And I think we were complete the email by about 2002.
And I guess what younger people might not realize is like the email service providers were completely different back then, much more of a rudimentary, technology. I don't know the exact timeline, but I talked to like one guy who was literally one of the first people to ever like start sending newsletters and become famous for them, like all the way in the early '90s when most people didn't even have email addresses, and if you weren't like a college professor or something like that. But you were using some kind of third party like email service provider. Were you like doing that all in house? Like how were you delivering these emails?
Yeah, we see back in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of telecom services that were completely competitive because there were licenses and monopolies and so on. One of the few, funnily enough, that was completely open to competition was fax broadcast. So there was a plethora of companies, particularly foreign telcos like Singapore Telecom or Deutsche Telekom from Germany, who had little fledgling operations in Australia offering fax broadcast as a major service. So I was constantly being wined and dined by these people because I was seen as a marquee customer. Oh, the telecom publication of Australia, that's the one we want. So, and then they added email as a bolt on, if that makes sense. So you can go to two mediums. So the transition wasn't that difficult. We actually eventually settled on a company called eCast, who are a little local Australian company operated out of a tiny little office in suburban Sydney. And that was in the like when I say mid 2000s, 2004, 5. And we've been with them ever since. And in fact, the guy who runs it's about to retire and has just told me I'm shutting down the service. You've got to find a new provider in the next few weeks. So I'm it's kind of funny. It does feel like a rite of passage that my original email supplier is retiring and I need to find a new one. So,
So once you switched to email, what did that do for the business? Like you kind of hinted at it before, where suddenly you could sell kind of group subscriptions because there could be
yeah.
going to individuals. But did it allow? Did it obviously you could forward emails much easier than you could pass around faxes and stuff like that. Did it change in terms of like the influence of the publication, the expansion of the publication? How did things like fundamentally change about the business once you started sending over email?
Well, there is a trust component, but so you obviously can be cheated on because we have a single user subscription, a multi user subscription, 5 users, 10 users, 50 users, and then an unlimited. They're all quite different price points, and the higher price points get into the 30,000 Australian dollar range. So they're high, but we are talking about companies that in some cases have revenues of multiple billions of dollars, and they're not necessarily culturally in the habit of breaking IP for the sake of saving a buck here or there. They're companies that operate with ethical frameworks when it comes to copyright. And we found that absolutely for the most part, companies, in terms of there being an honor system, are pretty good. Yeah, sometimes with a couple of exceptions. A giant multinational who I shall not name, I once caught them sending out comms day to 1,000 internal staff on a single user subscription. But once you catch them, you don't really have to do it twice. Yeah. So, but that hasn't happened very often, and I think because of the nature of my subscriber market, telecom is a heavily regulated area. Well, at least it is in Australia in terms of the conduct of the business. It has national security obligations. It operates often under discrete obligations in terms of customer care and how it treats consumers. There's a whole lot of dimensions to the business that are specific to telco and to internet providers that do encourage ethical behavior. So that's been to our benefit, I feel. Maybe it wouldn't be the same in other verticals.
Yeah. And so, you start in 2000s. That's already after, Ev Williams has launched Blogger platform. Then over the next, 6 or to 8 years, the blogosphere really comes into fruition. You see the launch of like Gawker, Business Insider, Huffington Post, all these blogs. What were the discussions going with you and your colleagues at Comms Day, like in terms of like were you ever thinking like were you ever having these discussions of like should we launch some kind of blog like website and just put stuff behind a paywall and people would have a login, or was it always just like no, this works, so we're just going to send this as a PDF every day?
Your last comment there, this works, encapsulates half of it, which is you've got something that people are used to receiving in a certain way, and they themselves are not directly saying, "Oh, we prefer this on a blog with a login," and hardly any of them ever did. You don't change something that's successful. So that's half of it. Like the actual customers weren't asking us for change. They were quite happy to get something on a PDF. PDF is a very, very conventional system for documentation in big corporations. So it's not as if they resented having to have a copy of Acrobat Reader on their desktop. They already had it. They're already consuming a lot of internal company communications that way. So that's not an issue. The other half of it is that the value in what we do is there's two aspects to it, which aren't present in a hyperlinked World Wide Web environment for news. The first element is that it's curated news content. Like we have a lead story, we have a certain logic in the news flow, we have briefs at the end, we have stock market prices. There's a flow to it, which people appreciate because it gives them all the talking points they need to sound intelligent when they have a meeting with someone that day in the industry or in their own company. And everyone's got a common frame of reference as to what's worth talking about. So there's that aspect to it. The second aspect is the serendipity of reading things that you didn't click a link on to get to. And that we found that our readers really appreciate that. So the problem is if you list 20 stories behind a hyperlink and people are time harried, they will only click on 2 or 3 of them, which means they're only actually getting 5 to 10% of the actual value of what you're publishing every day. That reflects in 2 things. It means they're ignorant of a lot of other things that are going on simply because they didn't get attracted by the headline. They've missed out on something. So they don't know as much as someone else. The second thing is that a lot of business opportunities, a lot of important knowledge in a commercial environment comes from serendipity. It's not the things that you think you're interested in, but the things that you didn't know you should be interested in that are often more important. So I think our format has endured because all those things are present with us and not in other places.
So obviously, there's I'm guessing a relatively small universe of companies that you can target in terms of like market penetration. Like, how much do you think about word of mouth versus sales? Like, do you think about like, oh, we're going to publish this story, it's going to get people talking, maybe people posting on social media or anything like that, and through that word of mouth, someone will have FOMO and eventually want to subscribe that way? Or like, how do you think about marketing? Because obviously it's very different than like my business or any kind of traditional media business where you want to publish obviously to the web, or you want to make sharing very easy, whereas like sharing, maybe they could forward the PDF, but there's no like easy link that they can throw into a Slack channel or something like that. Like, how do you think about word of mouth and the importance of that to your business?
Okay, so there's a couple of ways we get talked about or shared. We do virtually no marketing, by the way. In terms of our universe of customers that I think we should have, we have a 98% penetration. There's literally only 2% out there of what we think should be the constellation of readers who aren't reading us. So I don't think you can realistically get to 100%, ever of anything. So we're pretty happy with that. We don't need to do a lot of marketing. What often happens in big companies, and this is something maybe a lot of B2B publishers don't understand, is that if you write something that is intrinsically interesting or challenging to the interests of a reader's company, they will share that on their Slack channel. They'll screenshot a paragraph. What do you think about this? Did CommsDay get this right or wrong? If they're right, we're in big trouble. There's someone offering the same product for $10 a month cheaper than us or something, right? So you get talked about a lot at a C-suite level, as you say, on internal Slack channels or whatever they're using. And that does create the word of mouth. Now, if you've been around for 30 years as well, at some point you probably entered the industry at a more junior level. CommsDay was what your boss was reading. So you often tend to emulate the behavior of what your boss did when you get that job later on in your career. So we've become a habit. And to give you an example, the CEO of one of the biggest telcos in Australia reads CommsDay on her iPad, which is mounted on her gym, the handlebars on her exercise bike. And she reads CommsDay as she's doing her exercise bike activity every morning at about 6 o'clock in the morning. So you become a habit that people actually work into their day. The more diarized a person's day, the more likely they are to allocate time to read us. And that's the virtue of being around for a long time.
And like, what's the, you say you have 98% penetration from a reporting perspective. What's your interaction with your audience? Like, do they reply to these emails? Do you ever get news tips? Like, obviously you have access to all these email addresses. So you have you might have a database that you can comb through and be like, this person could maybe speak to this. Maybe I'll offer them anonymity. Like, how do you think about like the news gathering process as it relates to how you're getting news tips and collecting information from your email audience?
Yeah, look, we've achieved a position in our market where we are the way the industry talks to each other. So to just give you a little micro example of that, you might have the government wants to introduce some telecom policy and they'll open a consultation, okay, with a list of questions, and then all the different stakeholders each write submissions to that government inquiry. But they want to see CommsDay writing about their submission, what their suggestion is for how the policy could be improved. So they tend to CC us on the submission as they send it into the government. So we're getting first dibs on a lot of the things that stakeholders are saying about the industry or about their own activities or whatever. So a lot of it comes to us without us actually having to do anything. But then a lot of the bigger companies, as you know, have their own internal public relations, media relations people. So you have relationships with those people. If something happens, I feel it deserves a comment or a response from a particular stakeholder, we can call them up. Usually same day, you'll get a comment. It's 11 o'clock in the morning here now as we speak, and I could call up Telstra or Optus and have a comment in my inbox by 4 p.m. that helps inform a story and turns it into twice the story it is at this point of the day. So we do a lot of that kind of value add. As you can see from the sample copies that I sent you, unfortunately our viewers can't see those, but you can see that we do a lot of value add on the stories, looking for reaction, context, and adding background and context as to why something has happened.
What about like stuff that's more kind of not coming through official channels that maybe they don't even want to be publicized? Like, do you have channels? Do you do like a lot of that kind of reporting where it's like based on, anonymous reporting and stuff like that? And how do you kind of handle that stuff?
Yeah, we have a lot of back channels into stakeholders at all levels. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I don't want to compromise sources, but we have back channels. We know a lot more than we publish, if you know what I mean. That can inform us in negative ways. And what I mean by that is someone might be announcing something on which they want to impress upon you from a marketing point of view, but a back channel is telling you that it's probably not that important, that they've got something bigger planned in a week's time or whatever. And then that gives you the cues that you need to decide how that should be placed in your editorial process. How much prominence or time should you spend on that story, and you can up vote it or down vote it depending on what the back channels are telling you. So you use all that as context to decide your editorial priorities.
And so we talked about kind of like the rise of the blogosphere. You weren't really tempted by that. Obviously, then there was social media. I saw that it looks like the publication has like a fairly active LinkedIn account and has like 11,000 followers on there, but doesn't seem to be, active on much else. Like, what do you have any, like, what's your thinking about social media? Is it just kind of you teasing stories that are in the PDF, or obviously you're not trying to send a lot of traffic to your website itself? So is it just kind of like a kind of like a very kind of broad funnel marketing channel for you?
We go on LinkedIn because there's a certain element of the readership who like to share things on LinkedIn, or that's a place for better or for worse where a lot of people in the workplace spend their days. So we feel it's important to have a presence there. Um, a lot of smaller companies, in particular, are quite happy if they get coverage in Comms Day. So they like to screenshot an article and post it. Although that's technically against the terms of our copyright, we're pretty lenient on that because we appreciate that they like the fact that we've written about them and they want to tell the world about that, particularly if they're a small startup and they need a bit of a leg up in terms of profile or publicity. So we tend to let other people take the running on social media, if that makes sense. If they want to talk about us, we don't deter them. We allow it, we enable it, we encourage it.
Yeah. So obviously now there are like way more sophisticated newsletter platforms that you could be technically utilizing. Like, with like Substack, like I can put a paywall at any point in my newsletter and then send it out so that the free subscribers get everything above the paywall, but nothing behind it, and they have to subscribe to get the full thing, and then the paid subscribers get the full thing. I can embed polls. I can track like clicks on links and stuff like that. All things that I'm guessing you can't really do that well with the PDF, and you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But also you're limited in design. Like you can sort of design what the newsletter is going to look like, but then you're kind of at the mercy of whatever the email client that the person's using and whatever formatting that use. Whereas the PDF, it's going to be a uniform design no matter what. What are your thoughts about you sticking with a PDF versus like trying some of this more kind of sophisticated kind of email marketing or stuff like that, so you could like collect better data or anything or do do things with like free trials or stuff like that?
Yeah, when we do free trials, you can sign up for a free trial, sample it for a week or two. Then we send you a pitch at the end to buy it if you choose to or not to. As I say, we're at pretty full penetration of our market, so attracting new subscribers isn't a focus. Keeping the existing ones is 99.9% of what we think about. In terms of sophistication of email marketing, I can measure opens because the email body requires you to download an image, and that's a catalyst from a technical point of view, just seeing if an email has been read or not. So I actually have a very good idea what my opens are every day. And I actually use that partly for diagnostics because sometimes individual companies have failures in their intranets or for some reason they're blocking us. So we need to know who can open us or not in order to diagnose issues if and when they arise. So from that point of view, we don't really have an issue with the way we do things. You actually hit the nail on the head just then in your observation that we can control how something looks in a PDF. That's important to us because a big source of ancillary income for us is our events and conferences. And we can broadcast advertising about our conferences in the PDF, which doesn't require you to click on a link to get there or anything. It's there if you're reading Comms Day. Everyone's getting the message. That's a really, really important way for us to build our business and get additional revenue. Our conferences represent nearly half of our business in terms of revenue. So it's really important that we can control the look of how we come across to an end reader. And that's another reason why PDF is such an important medium for us.
So you mentioned that the logos in the newsletter in the PDF were just in reference to the conferences. Did you make a conscious decision at some point that in the newsletter itself you didn't want to have sponsors?
Yeah, because I mean, I don't know what it's like across the rest of the Anglosphere now, but it's a really big selling point for us that our journalism is neutral. It's not sponsored. And there's plenty of B2B media outlets with sponsored websites where big swathes of topics are off limits to them because they can't offend an advertiser. And I don't have any individual company representing more than about 1.5% or 2% of my revenues, which basically means I don't care if I offend you. Like, you're not going to bankrupt me. You can't threaten to withdraw your custom and affect my editorial coverage. I think that's really important. And I do get that sponsorship revenue through a conference model, but it's a step removed from the daily coverage of Comms Day. So it doesn't influence what we do at Comms Day. And I actually outsource all my sales, my sponsorship sales, to a person who's not even in the same city as me, which keeps that wall between editorial and sponsorship really, really pronounced. So we don't suffer the curse of a lot of B2B media where editorial and sales are in the same open plan office and they can't help but infuse each other. We definitely do not have that here.
How do you think about AI as it relates, like, to a threat to your business? I would warrant to say that a PDF sent through an email is not easily crawlable by a large language model. And since you were publishing super niche, and probably a lot of the news you're publishing is kind of exclusive to you, like you literally are pretty wet. Like, you have a huge moat. Maybe unintentionally, not realizing that this wave was coming, but you have a huge moat against, LLMs like sucking up all your information and then, degrading your value over time.
You're absolutely right, because we're not discoverable on the web, which has become a virtue and not a vice as time has gone on. Um, um, there isn't that risk of an AI model just picking us up unless they actively subscribe to us and then do it. What's more of a risk is a big subscriber. Let's say, Acme Telecom, or just make up an example, that has so many bits of information coming into the company that they decide to centralize it and chuck it all in an AI model to generate a daily summary. And that's probably more of a threat to us. At the moment, that's not really happening. Probably the vortex where that might start to happen is through media monitoring companies, where I could see where they might go down that path and create their own little AI summary newsletters for verticals based on, inputting, a million different data points that they're already collecting. That could be a threat to us. I keep a watching brief on it. Luckily, one of my special subject matters is AI, so I'm pretty aware of what's going on in that area. Certainly, I'm not ignorant of the threats. Put it that way.
Yeah. But, like, an AI doesn't pick up the phone and interview people. So, like, I would say the greater threat is it sucking up your information, but currently it doesn't really have a good, there's probably no good way. You're probably not on OpenAI's radar at all as like a potential,
Yeah, that's right.
source.
We're too niche. Yeah, yeah. And actually, you make a really good point there about picking up the phone, and we're quite immersive. I've been doing this for 30 years, so as you might expect, I have a hell of a lot of friends and sources in the industry. People I've grown up with who are 25 years old and nothings, when they started out, and now CEOs of big companies, and these people have remained my personal friends. So you're absolutely right. An AI algorithm cannot duplicate human relationships or trust. In fact, the biggest issue with AI is trust, as it so happens. So trust is definitely a big currency that we, play in, particularly with our sources, who know they can trust us not to burn them or to compromise them, but also to be intelligent about stuff and not to beat things up or whatever. So, but I think that is a bit of a moat for us. But that said, there is still a threat that people do take those written words and throw them into some sort of AI summarization process, which diminishes our economic value in the long term.
So tell me, so when did you start doing events?
25 years ago, almost to the month actually. Um, it was an obvious direction to go into when we created a community of people in the industry who were reading information. It became a quite logical step to then put them all in a room once a year and have them speak to each other. It wasn't any big, amazing corporate decision. It was just a logical thing to do. We've got better and better at it as time has gone on. and we work with some really excellent people. Um, um, and we run an industry awards night. We do 3 conferences a year in Australia, one in Sydney, one in Canberra, and one in Melbourne, which is the triangle of power, if you like, in this country. It's a really durable model, and I might say a little bit boring. We're not doing exciting new things all the time. Our predictability is our virtue. You know that every June we do something in Sydney, and every February we do something in Canberra, and so on. And you become part of a kind of annual calendar for people, if you like. So having that predictability is very important.
So is it like are you have you like launched events or conferences in like different niches within telecom, or is it just like 3 times a year? It's just wherever what proximity wherever whatever conference you're in proximity, that's the one your company goes to, or like how do you think about the opportunities to like to diversify your content at the conferences?
Yeah, so we have a peak conference in Sydney every year, which kind of makes sense. It's the city where most of our customers are. So that's the peak conference, if you like. The one we do in Canberra, being the nation's capital, is quite focused on government policy, on industry advocacy to government, so a bit more policy and regulation focused. And the one we do in Melbourne is a bit more of a salesy conference, a bit more around expo booths and wholesalers looking for retail customers, that kind of stuff. So it's a bit more of the commercial salesy side of things. So they all have their own characters and flavors, yes.
And then is it kind of like the traditional mixture of sponsorships and ticket sales?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So to give you an example, we've got a conference coming up here in about a month in Sydney. We have over 30 sponsors. We're expecting about 400 delegates, about 3/4 of whom will be paid delegates, and the other ones are guests of the sponsors. So we'll be doing that in the Fullerton Hotel, which is one of the major 5-star hotels in Sydney. And we do an industry awards night as part of that, and we expect to have 450 people in the room for that. So gives you an idea of the scale of what we do.
So I usually in my interviews by saying when you look ahead 3 years from now, what do you hope to be doing that you're not doing now? But you guys have been around long enough to it seems like if you wanted to expand further, you probably would have at this point. But it sounds like you're comfortable with your 98% penetration. It sounds like maybe you're not like obviously when you're brainstorming ways you could expand, you could expand into adjacent industries or cover launch telecom coverage in more countries and stuff like that. Was that ever thought about, or you're like this is I have a system that works. I have the 98% penetration. I'm delivering a product that people like. Why break something that's already fine?
Yeah, okay. So we've tried a few, and in fact, part of my story is my failures more than my successes. So we've tried a few expansion strategies over the years, which obviously didn't work because they're not around anymore. We did expand into Asia at one point and tried to do a daily English language paid news service for Asia. It didn't work commercially in any more than a break even sense, primarily because of cultural differences. And in Asia, there is less of a propensity to pay for information. It's seen as an intangible with no value, just very different. And I use the term the Anglosphere deliberately because I'm not so familiar with non-English European markets, so I don't want to kind of include them in my comparison. But in places like America and the UK, there's a long tradition of subscription publishing. And in America, it goes back to the 1920s with the Kiplinger letter and that type of thing. So we found that we couldn't make our model work in Asia. If we decided to go with an events strategy, we probably could have done that. We'd probably be 10 times the size of what we are now, to be honest. But part of the reason, as you know, Simon, you own and run your own business is because you want it to be fun. You want it to be enjoyable. I didn't particularly want to spend the next few years of my life in airport lounges for flying around, specking out hotels in various Asian cities. This is not something I wanted to do as my life. I'm still quite proud of the fact I'm still primarily a journalist, and I kind of prefer to work to my comfort area. In that sense, we've tried to do a couple of other things in other geographies as well. We tried to do something more standalone in New Zealand, found that it wasn't a big enough market to support a discrete operation. We learned that very quickly, actually. Australia is in a sweet spot. It's 26 million people. It's about it's a 2 trillion US dollar economy, which puts it in this kind of middle rank where there's not a lot of competition in Australia. We, if you look at every industry in Australia, they're oligopolies pretty much. Two airlines, three commercial TV networks, so on and so on. There's not a lot of competition. Four banks. You go to bigger markets like America, there are people like us there already. You referred to us as being called Communications Daily before. We're actually Communications Day deliberately because there's a Communications Daily in the US. We don't want to infringe on their trademark. And there's a few titles in America doing dedicated daily subscription telecom news. There used to be a couple in the UK. There may not be anymore, but we're a certain size of market. So I've thought about New Zealand, failed. I've thought about Asia, too difficult to sell. I've even thought about novel things like Canada and South Africa, but again, I I don't have sufficient market knowledge, I think, to successfully make the leaps into those areas. So I've been quite happy to stick to my knitting.
And you said that you've kind of though expanded the definition of telecom to like cover like data centers and stuff like that. How are you thinking about kind of expanding
Yeah.
into like adjacent niches and stuff like that?
Well, it's good. It's a very good question, Simon. We're very lucky in Australia in that the global so-called hyperscale companies like Amazon, Meta, Google have identified Australia as pretty much being the place where they want to put all their backup infrastructure. And what I mean by that is those big data centers that house the clusters and the servers that provide us with the internet, with the cloud, with AI increasingly. They see Australia as being the place to serve the Eastern Hemisphere from, for various reasons, political, regulatory, geopolitical stability is a big one of them. And they're engaged in a spending spree right now, building submarine cables from all around the world to Australia. So to give you an example, Google is building cables to Australia from South Africa, from Oman, from India, from Thailand, from Fiji, from the US, from French Polynesia, and from Chile. And I'm seriously not exaggerating that. That is the scale of the mesh network they're creating. So at the moment, Australia, on some measures, is second in the world for infrastructure investment in this area, in what we broadly call digital infrastructure. And that's put us in a really sweet spot as the kind of ranking telco publication in this part of the world because we're chronicling all of that. We talk to these people all the time. We were talking to a vice president of SpaceX last week. These people all turn up in Sydney once or twice a year and want to talk to the local media outlet. So we get a lot of access to these people. So we're in a really sweet spot right now because of where AI investment's hitting in the world, and it's only going to a few countries.
And do you have to hire more reporters or something to cover that, or how does that fit into how you're like going about the editorial coverage? Or is it all just going into the same exact newsletter that's going out to everyone, or
Yeah, it's just rebalanced the coverage really. There's a lot more about data centers. It means I have a lot more grey hair. I get a lot less sleep. That's really how we deal with it. But it's also a good thing because if you cover the same area and the same companies for a long time, it can be boring. It can be repetitive. It can be difficult to keep younger staff stimulated, obviously. Um, so having all this dynamic change makes it a much more interesting place to work and live your life.
okay, Graham? Those are all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
www.comsday.com.
Awesome. Well, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Simon.